that are in chapter 13. So if you have a copy of the book and what we passed out, then look at lesson 13. And there are about 6 questions in there, but I would be willing to try to take a few more if something's come to mind. If something has been on your mind, maybe you've made notes of that you'd like to ask tonight, we may have a few minutes at the end because this video is a little shorter that we can get to. And if we have a little time tonight, we'll try to look at the ones from maybe a couple from next week. So, because I think there's some good questions, especially next week. And I had jotted down a couple of more when I taught this before. So it may be that something's come to your mind to ask you that's you've wanted to ask about a particular way of handling something or doing something. And so we will watch this video tonight. We'll have a little bit of discussion about it. If you have your notes with you, this is lesson 12, and it's pretty much word for word from the video. And so if you've read ahead, then you've kind of heard some of this. But of course, it's always great to hear our brother Kyle Butt tell it just a little differently or in his own words. So also, when we are done next Wednesday night, we will be the end of the first quarter. The start of the second quarter, the next week, will be our gospel meeting. And so we'll miss the very first week of the quarter being in here. We will have no classes that night on Wednesday night, no classes, and we'll just have our regular evening service in here on Wednesday night. The week after that, we will begin something new. So I met with the elders this morning. We were talking about it. We kicked around a couple ideas. If you have anything that's come to your mind, particular book of the Bible, particular topic, something like that, then just let me know, and we've got a couple of weeks here where I have been thinking about some things. But if you have something that's of interest to you that you think might be beneficial, then we could change and look at that. And we've got a few weeks before we have to kick that off. We'll also lose a week, I think, to VBS, so that's should be a shortened quarter in the second quarter. But we will have something that's at least 11 or 12 weeks worth of study, and so I just wanted to make mention of that as well. Tonight's a bit of a review. He'll go over a lot of the lessons, at least the main bullet points from those lessons. But I think it's a good way to help us think about some of this. And so, Brother Tim, if you'll fire us up there, we'll watch this and then have a little bit of discussion.
Several years ago, there was a movie that was put out called The Karate Kid. And the first edition of The Karate Kid was where there was a young man named Daniel who had moved to a new school, and he was getting picked on by some of the school bullies, and he wanted help to learn how to do karate. And there was a man in his apartment complex named Mr. Miyagi, and Mr. Miyagi, Daniel found out, used to be a karate champion. And he went to Mr. Miyagi and he asked him, "Will you help me learn to do karate?" And after much cajoling and asking and begging, Mr. Miyagi finally said, "Yes. Yes, I will help you learn karate. Come to my house at this particular time and we'll begin our training." And so Daniel showed up at that time, and Mr. Miyagi said, "Do you see all of these cars? I want you to wax them. And this is how I want you to wax the cars with this particular motion." Well, Daniel didn't know what the situation was, but he had agreed basically to do what his teacher told him to do. And so for the whole day, he waxes every one of the cars, and it looks like there's about 20 of them. And periodically, Mr. Miyagi would come by and he would see Daniel doing the waxing motion wrong, and he would stop him and say, "No, it's not that, it's this." Well, again, Mr. Miyagi said, come to my house at this particular time on this particular day. And he showed up, and this day he said, today you'll paint the fence. And when you paint the fence, go up the fence and down the fence, up the fence and down the fence. Well, Daniel again had no idea why he was being asked to paint the fence, could not see how this had anything to do with what he wanted done, which was karate. And he started painting the fence, and he would be doing it wrong sometimes, and Mr. Miyagi would come up and say, no, that's not how you do it. You do it like this, up and down, up and down. So he paints the fence for several days. Well, he's getting very tired of this, and he comes again at an appointed time, and Mr. Miyagi said he wanted him to sand the floor, and there was in the back of Mr. Miyagi's house a deck that spread basically over the whole backyard, and he wanted Daniel to hand sand it. And he said, you sand the floor like this and like this. And he showed him how to do it. Well, finally, after sanding the floor, probably for several days, he comes and Daniel gets very angry at Mr. Miyagi. And he says, I asked you to help me with karate, and you haven't done anything but made me your personal slave. All you have wanted to do is get work out of me, and I quit. And Mr. Miyagi then said, sand the floor. And when he did, Mr. Miyagi did a kick motion, and the sand the floor motion blocked that kick. And he said, paint the fence. And that paint the fence motion blocked the punch that Mr. Miyagi was delivering. And what Daniel saw was that everything Mr. Miyagi had been doing for Daniel was to build his muscles so he would be ready to do the perfect moves to defend himself and to be good at karate. Daniel just didn't know what the plan was, but all along the teacher had the plan. You see, he was doing those things for Daniel's good. Well, when we come to giving, we're talking about a new perspective on giving. And what we mean by that is the old perspective that I would say is one where people view it as a chore. They view it as something they have to do. They view it as something that diminishes the joy in their life and that makes them feel worse. And that's never been God's plan for giving. In fact, people who have taken God up on His dare will show you and tell you that's never the result of scriptural giving. God has always had in His mind our good always. That's what He said there in Deuteronomy chapter 6, that God's instructions, all of them, are always for our good every single time. We have done quite a bit of work in this series. We have gone from the initial concept of stewardship, and we have built on that understanding that God owns everything. And then we have said that as we are giving to God, we want to come to the realization that it's more blessed to give than to receive, and we want to be a part of the joy of generosity. And as we understand that stewardship idea, then we'll give to God first. And we'll give God the first fruits, and that will be at the top of our list of giving. And then as we've built on that, we've seen that once we decide we're going to give to God first, then we're going to purpose in our heart what we will give. It will be the thing we make a decision to do before we ever get any money. And as we purpose in our heart, then we looked at giving as we have prospered. And that idea of giving as we have prospered means that it is a percentage of our income. And we looked at how in the Old Testament, nobody could be considered a generous, liberal giver that gave anything less than 10%. And as we looked in the New Testament, we saw that there really ultimately were only 3 percentages ever mentioned. And that was 100% for the widow in Mark chapter 12, 100% for the rich young ruler, and 50% for Zacchaeus. And we said how absurd it would be for an Old Testament Jew to become a Christian and to understand that he now has a better sacrifice with better promises, and then somehow to get from that instead of giving, they were giving about 25 to 35% of their income, they could drop it down to 2% and still be considered a generous, liberal giver. We talked about how as we have prospered means a percentage that we've decided to give before we get any money. And when that money comes to us, we just make a calculation and not a decision, and then we give that. And we also talked about God's dare. and how God in Malachi chapter 3 said, if you will test me and prove me now in this, and you will bring all the tithes into the storehouses that there may be food in my house, then I will open the windows of heaven for you and pour down on you so many blessings that you won't be able to receive them all. And we talked about how the benefits of giving cheerfully and generously and liberally are clearly laid out throughout the Bible. And you go to Proverbs chapter 3, and you look in verses 9 and 10, and the text there tells us that if we give God these first fruits of our increase, then our vats will be filled and our barns will overflow with grain and crops. And we looked at Luke chapter 6, verse 38, and how the text says, give, and it will be given to you, pressed down, shaken together, pouring over will be given into your bosom. And then we looked at several other passages that talk about sowing and reaping, and how when you sow bountifully, you reap bountifully. But if you sow sparingly, you reap sparingly. And we saw how God commissions us to be cheerful givers, and the reasons that there are to be cheerful givers. You know, some of those reasons being it gets us out from under the curse of non-scriptural giving. Remember, we did that whole lesson on how God curses a person who doesn't give scripturally and doesn't give as God has asked them to give. And then we looked at how money is powerful and can be dangerous. But that doesn't make it a bad thing. It just means we need to learn to control it. And we saw how controlling money and showing money who's boss and not letting money boss us around and make sure we are in control of that money. Well, as we get this new perspective, this idea that it is more blessed to give than to receive, we come to the end of the series. We've got another lesson that we probably won't have a video on for you because you'll just be discussing some questions and answers along those lines. And this is really the wrap-up video. And you start to realize, God hadn't done this for himself. God hasn't asked us to give and given us this sowing and reaping principle because it's better for him, as if God needed anything from us. God wants to let us be a part of his work. And that is a thrilling and exciting idea. Have you ever seen a mother who goes to her daughter and explains to the daughter that the mother is about to make cookies, and the daughter says, "Oh, I want to be a part of that. Can I help you make cookies?" Why does a mother allow a 4-year-old to help her make cookies? Is it because she thinks that the cookie process is going to go much smoother with a 4-year-old involved? You and I both know that that's not the case. You get that cookie preparation material out there, and you have your mixing bowl and your flour and your butter, and you've let the butter soften. And now people who make cookies understand that when you soften butter, you don't want to smash the butter in the little paper wrapper. It's strategically designed so that you can grab one of the sides of the wrapper, and with just a little effort, you can flip it down into the bowl. It will cascade down that paper wrapper and flop right into the bowl. You know that. You've been cooking cookies for years. 4-year-olds don't. In fact, 4-year-olds think that the texture of soft butter in a paper wrapper is pretty interesting. And when they pick it up and smush it, they think, ooh, this is nice. And then when they try to open that up and try to scrape the butter off of that wrapper, they get a little on their finger and they feel like they need to taste the butter. And so they taste the butter, and then they want to help with the flour. And this mother lets the 4-year-old help with the flour. And the mother has been cooking cookies for years, and she knows that if you get some flour in a cup, then the best way to transfer it into the mixing bowl is just to put it on the edge of the mixing bowl, and just with a flip of the wrist, you just turn it right into the bowl. Well, 4-year-olds don't know that, and so they grab that flour, and they want a little taste of that too, and so they take a little pinch of the flour, and then they feel like a good high arcing toss into the bowl is the best option to get flour from the cup into the mixing bowl. And so that's what they do. And in the middle of the arc, the flour flies all over the place. And instead of just flipping it in, they have flour all over everything now. And you don't even know how much flour is in. The sugar was tasted as well. You don't know how much sugar is in. And you wonder what in the world these cookies are going to turn out like. And the mom lets the 4-year-old help her make cookies. Why? Not because the mom needs the help. It's because the 4-year-old needs to be involved in the process. And when they put those cookies in that oven and those cookies come out and that 4-year-old little girl gets to take a platter of cookies to her dad or to her siblings, and she gets to say, look what I did. Look what I helped mommy do. She gets to feel like she's a part of something. She gets to be plugged in, and she got to help make the cookies. You see, the mom could have done that herself and probably more effectively, and the cookies probably could have turned out a little bit better, but the 4-year-old needed to be involved in the process. Isn't it exciting that God allows us to be involved in the giving process, and not only allows us to be involved in it, but says, if you will do it my way, then I will bless you in ways that you never thought possible, so many ways that you won't be able to receive them all, that I will bless you to the point that you understand that it's more blessed to give than to receive, and I will let you be a part of my work. That's a thrilling idea, isn't it? There is a golf course, the Augusta National, there in Georgia. It's one of the most prestigious, elite, very, very small groups of people who play golf in the world. In fact, some of the richest men in the world can't get in the Augusta National. I was reading just recently about a man who is a multi-billionaire who has been dropping hints in every shape, form, and fashion to try to get included in this particular very elite golf club. And to date, they haven't invited him. And one of the reasons that was given in this particular article that I was reading was because he was acting like he wanted to be a part of it too much. But as you look at how you know if you're a member or chosen to be a member of the Augusta National, where they play the Masters golf tournament, well, at the end of their year, they add up all of the cost and whatever money they need, and you find out if you're in or if you get to stay in when they send you a bill and let you pay multiple thousands of dollars to be involved. And billionaires across the world are begging to get a bill to the Augusta National so they can be members. And they let them pay money. But isn't it thrilling to know that God not only lets us be a part of His work, but in the process, He watches as we become godly like Him, as we become givers like Him, as we spiritually mature to the point where we recognize the truth. We're not just taking God's word for it anymore, although that would be a certainly sufficient means of us understanding a truth. But when we read it's more blessed to give than receive, we're looking at that from a point of experience and understanding and wanting to teach others that truth so they can be involved in what we get to experience. Oh, taste and see that the Lord, He is good. A new perspective on giving is that there is a joy in generosity that you won't get to feel in your life unless you get plugged in to God's way of giving. And I invite everyone listening, everyone watching, to join with me and be a part of this joy, of this blessing, of this excitement of life that you can only experience when you are plugged into God's way of giving.
If you've got your book handy, excuse me, we'll turn to page 56. We'll pick up there on this next to last lesson, page 56, and the 12th lesson, a new perspective on giving. You know, most of the time, if somebody called you a 4-year-old, it'd probably hurt your feelings, right? But I couldn't help but think that as he was giving that illustration on the cookies, we act like a bunch of 4-year-olds sometimes, and there's a lot of truth behind that. Because we decide that we're not going to think about doing it God's way, that we're not going to try to do what God has asked us to do. And not just what God has asked us to do, and even as we're going to talk about a little bit next week through some of these questions, what God has commanded us to do, but through these lessons, I'm glad he kind of reviewed some of them here in this last part because kind of refreshed our memory on some of the things. Also the blessing that's promised that comes along with it. It's not that God is begging us because he has to have it, but it's because he allows us to be a part of the work that is being done. And sometimes we behave like 4-year-olds and we look at it in a way that it's difficult and it's annoying and it's a chore and all those things that he kind of brought up there in the video, that's the way we commonly think of it. And so I think this is a pretty good lesson to sort of think about ending on, because it's the idea, before we get to the questions again next week, but of a new perspective. Many of you have expressed that through the course of this study, and I appreciate that. We want to know if you're getting benefit out of it, if it's been something that's good. But many of you have expressed that you have taken at least something, if not multiple things, from this study that's caused you to think a little bit about giving. And as we have emphasized week to week, we're not just talking about the trays that sit here, the plates that sit here on the table and that we pass around. That's certainly a part of it. But it's also just that giving attitude and spirit that we should have in all things. As we even touched on Sunday morning, the idea of the fires that took place, and you have probably seen, around on Facebook and things, if you are a part of that, a lot of people thanking folks for their generosity. And that's a community-wide thing, a lot of different people, but the giving spirit is one that we should have when there's a lot of different needs, including the need of the congregation, the work of the local church here, and that's a part of one of the questions we'll get to here in just a few moments. I know we got a few young pups in here that may not know what the Karate Kid is. It's kind of scary to think about. It makes me feel kind of old. But most of you remember the 1984 movie, Karate Kid, that was a lesson in several things, right? If you watch that and you appreciate that movie, and there's several lessons in that, I would have never thought to connect that with, a lesson on giving. But what a concept there, what a thought process to think about. That what God does for us, the way that he teaches us, the way that he tries to help us understand things. And we get so frustrated with our children. We've mentioned this a few times, but we get so frustrated with our children when we're trying to teach them and help them do the right thing, and they continue to mess up, and they don't do it, they don't listen, they don't pay attention. And yet when we think about being God's children, when we think about trying, God wanting us to do what he has asked us to do, and yet we, a global we, a mankind we, and even, yes, sometimes we as Christians mess that up. We find ways to twist it and contort it. And what seems like, even as I appreciate so much the way that Kyle presents all of this and it's been put together, seems so easy and so exciting and something we should do, we still turn it in something that's difficult, that's very, very hard. That was kind of a review, but any comments or questions on what we heard tonight, or just in general as we begin to wrap up?
The concept of it's more blessed to give than to receive. Now you can find that statement made there as Paul's talking to the Ephesian elders, and that quotation made, and you can say, okay, I understand that's what God said. It's more blessed to give than to receive. But the idea is, of course, is that that's something that God says. And that's something that at some point in time, hopefully in the future, as you mature, you will realize that's been the case, even if it wasn't written down. You'll understand it by experience, the way it should be, And that's like so many other of these things, It's you say, well, why do we believe that? Because God said so. Well, then ultimately, as you grow and mature, then it's more than simply God said so, because you've experienced over time the very thing that God said that you had to accept because God said so, but now you know it to be true because you've experienced that way. Yeah. And that's the way spiritual maturity always does work.
Sure. I think I preached the lesson here maybe last year at some point, but the idea of, when we think about doing what God says, the motivation behind why we do certain things, and the fact that there are some things that we do simply because God said so. There are a few of those in which that's the case. And we talked about baptism a good bit, and we've even used the picture sometimes this year on the last slide at the sermon to show that we're baptized because God says so. That's the way God said to do it. That's the way, the mode and all the ways that go along with that. But we do see the beautiful picture where it also connects. But as Freddie is talking about, and absolutely true, sometimes we do it because God said so, and then we begin to see the benefit of that. And, when we were at the Freed Hardman lectureship last week, I don't know if it was when we were there, we had to leave early, but one day Kyle Butt, I think, had a question in the open forum session where they're answering questions that people have submitted. But a question came up about, and essentially the whole point that I'm trying to make is, the question was, is it sinful, to do whatever, to fill in the blank? And he brought up the fact that we do that a lot. We make it about, is it sinful? And instead of thinking about, why we should be doing it or what the benefit of doing it is. And we want to know what's a sin. We want to try to understand those things. But that's not always the best reason to think about why we do certain things. Brother Charles? Mm-hmm. Yeah. 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 It's a comforting thought to think about laying forth ahead, laying up your treasures in heaven is the way that we, quote the verse, the way the verse reads, but Kyle did a good job even there with turning it just a little bit, making us think about it a different way. The idea of not being able to have it here, but just paying it forward even in a sense. So the other thing I was going to mention, and we take other comments or questions, we still got several minutes in this class, but is the idea of like a church attendance. It's the same thing. Somebody said, well, is it a sin to miss Sunday night? Or is it a sin to do this or do that? Instead, as Freddie's talking about, the example he gave just a moment ago, when you're a kid, that's your question. Am I going to be in trouble if I don't go? Is it a sin to not go? And then as Freddie's pointing out, what happens is as we get older, we begin to see the benefit of going. Not just that we get to come and worship God, but that we are encouraged. And that doesn't mean as much to you when you're 15, 16, even 18 or 21 sometimes. But when you get to be older and you've had a bad day and you think you don't want to go, but then you go and you realize you've been encouraged by somebody, you see the benefit of it. That it's not just because I have to. And even when we preach lessons about attendance, we talk about the fact that this is what the elders here have said, and we're obeying the elders. It's not just that, but there are benefits outside of that. And he talked about, one of the lessons about the benefits of giving. He talked about the things in connection with that, both with our giving, the physical blessings, the emotional blessings that we receive when we do that, that you can receive even if it's not necessarily connected to people who claim to be Christians. It's still there. So what else? Comments or questions here? Yeah, so Tammy brought it up there if you read ahead, but if you have a Bible handy, you can turn to Esther chapter 4. As I mentioned, the video went almost word for word through the lesson, kind of, with a lot of part of it, but one part he did skip was about the idea of God finding a way, is the way that it's titled there on page 57. But I wanted to point out, and we're familiar with, if I say Esther 4:14, most of you know, certainly most of the ladies in here know, they've heard it at Ladies' Days, that kind of thing, but the very last part, in fact, we might call it, as we sometimes do, part B or even part C, 14C, which says, yet who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this. And it's powerful, it's wonderful, lots of lessons, lots of ladies' days, lots of encouraging things to think about. There really, really is, not to take away from that. But if you don't read what's right before it, maybe part B, we might call it there, when Mordecai is talking to Esther, and let's just start at the beginning, for if you remain completely silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place. You know, that phrase there, this idea, as Tammy mentioned just a moment ago, but he points out on 57 and 58, if you have your notes open there handy, but the idea that, connected with that is, the word, in Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego kind of give the same thing, right? They're in the fiery furnace. We don't know. Yes, you think we know that God's going to pull us out and that's it. We don't know for sure, but it doesn't really matter whether that's the case or not. God's will be done. Esther has a similar phrase here, or Mordecai does here, of, you can do this, and this would be a wonderful thing, and this may be your time to do this, but if you choose not to, God will find deliverance. In the lesson on page 58, he gives the story about Joseph of Arimathea, right, in that tomb, and being a generous giver, of giving of something that would have been, probably generous to give in their day and time, certainly. And he asked the question, would God have allowed a 700-year-old prophecy to be thwarted by the stinginess of one individual? And then Kyle says, we all know better. And so when we think about that, yes, God could have made us robots. God could fund the work of the church at Dunlap exactly the way he thinks it needs to be, and put money in the bank account and that be it. But instead, we are able to learn a lesson. We're able to be a part of this. And as Freddie talks about, it is sometimes a lifelong lesson of it's more blessed to give than to receive. We start when they're toddlers. We start when they're young, trying to get them to understand that. And it almost seems like we joked a few weeks ago, we lose our way as adults. We kind of forget that. We become a little more stingy. But then sometimes you come back around as you get even older, and you realize that that is absolutely scriptural, and it is absolutely true. Sharing, yeah.
That was one of the first things that I think parents did, was before they sent the kids to school, they had already established the principle of, is sharing. If you've got enough for you and somebody else, then, and of course it may not have been taught, but it seemed like everybody understood that principle. I understood it,
Yeah.
People were willing to share what they had. If somebody didn't have a pencil, then you'd share a pencil.
Yeah.
If you had two pencils. Now, I don't know if that's gone by the wayside or what, but that's the whole principle too, of being willing to give what you have to benefit others. And it's not giving everybody, not giving somebody your pencil so you won't have one, you won't have to do writing.
Sure.
It's being willing to actually sacrifice something that you have for the benefit of somebody else.
Yeah. What else? Comments or questions? If you have your notes there, and some of you I know don't have a copy of this, but go on over to page 64 for just a moment, and I'll try to give some color, some context here for those who don't have a copy of the lesson in front of them. But I thought we could go ahead and try to look at a couple of these questions tonight, because they will help us get through a few of these. And like I said, if you have something, I'll just be honest. I'd appreciate if you give it to me ahead of time so I can study a little bit. But if you want to come next week and you've thought of something, we'll take questions as you can. But if there's something's come up and you've thought about asking, you can send me a text message or give me a call, and we can put it down in our list and try to work through as many as we can next week. But on page 64, one of the questions that I think doesn't necessarily come up for people sometimes, but it should, is it's listed here in question 5. When on vacation and or visiting another congregation, should a person make arrangements to give his local congregation or give where he is visiting? Now, I jumped right into the question there, and I didn't take time. If you've not read ahead, if you have your notes there, you can look back on page 61 at the very beginning. But Kyle and the man who helped him write this material says that this chapter is given to a series of questions, and many of these involve, and I underlined it the first time I taught this, personal opinion. There's sometimes that we can give an opinion on something, understanding that maybe that Scripture doesn't tell us exactly what to do, but what he says here then is, however, we have tried to base our answers on a proper understanding of the Scripture. Because what is true is that the Bible may not say that you've got to leave money behind or something like that if you go on vacation, or you have to give before you leave the zip code that you live in, or you're in sin. It doesn't say that, but we can understand biblical principles that are found in Scripture to help us think about what is a best practice. I mean, if you're in business, some of you may have been in business before, or manufacturing or those kinds of things. A lot of times they'll talk about what's a best practice. Not just something we can get by with, not just a procedure that might get somebody hurt while they're trying to perform this task at work, but a best practice to get the best results. And so that's what we're trying to think about with some of these. And of course, you'll be able to read, if you have a copy, their answers. We'll talk about those. I don't care to give mine on some things, and most of the time they'll probably agree. But there under that question, I underlined 2 words if you have your notes, and they're about the 3rd line. But that is that we as members should be willing to give on a regular and predictable basis. We should be willing to try to give as best we can. And it says here, give our elders an opportunity to effectively carry out the work. Now, one thing that's true for probably almost everybody in here, I think, maybe a few of us, but is that almost every single one of us in here tonight have not been on a mission field, sitting in the Ukraine or Russia or China or somewhere, and going to try to pay a bill or buy food or do something, and there's not any money in the account because Freddie and Tony said, well, we don't have any money this month, and we were supposed to pay you $500 a month that we promised to support you in this work, and we don't have it, and we're sorry, and you're stranded out there with no money. Most of us have never been there. Although we can appreciate what that might feel like, we can try to understand. And so we understand, even as you hopefully have your own budget to some extent in your family or your own household, and you understand that you've got to pay these bills and to buy food and to do these kinds of things. We know that concept. And that's really what we're talking about with this in a way. That no, the Scripture, you cannot turn to 2 Corinthians 32 and 432, and it says, again, you have to give before you go out of town or you're in sin. But there are a lot of factors that come into play when we talk about what we're going to give, or we even maybe commit sometimes to a certain amount, or the elders just, they do know, as we even put up here typically week to week, what the typical offering is, and they do their best. I mean, they spend months, and most of you know this, but they spend months, October sometimes, November and December, looking over last year, maybe even the year before, thinking about the future and trying to understand what we can appropriately do so that we don't leave somebody in China with no money because we can't afford to pay them, or we can't send them the money we promised, or we can't keep the lights on, and we got to cancel VBS because we didn't save enough money or have enough money to be able to take care of that. I mean, it seems pretty simple now, but yet many, I be careful with my words here, many people just don't think about it when they go out of town or when they think they go on vacation or things like that. Now, the very end of the question there said, should they make arrangements, or it says, or give where he or she may be visiting. If you would like to give where you're visiting, there's certainly nothing wrong with that. That's your prerogative if you would like to give some there. But without going through and reading every word of this, he says we need to first consider our congregation and whether or not arrangements can and should be made to get that money that we would give commonly, typically, to the congregation, our home congregation, to be sure that the work can continue to be done. I love it, regular and predictable. That sounds a little cold. Even as we mentioned before, the lesson on giving as we have prospered, he said it needs to be a calculation. That helps us. When it's a calculation, that sounds very cold, but it also sounds predictable to some degree, and it helps people be able to do the work that they want to do. Any of you elders want to jump in now?
The whole idea of a home congregation, you obviously have great responsibility for the home congregation and the congregation you're visiting at, for sure. I've known people who never, I don't know how they got as old as they was and didn't understand the principle, but they'd say, well, they need my money just as much as we do. I said, well, wait a minute now. Are you more concerned about somebody down the road's electric bill getting paid than you
Yeah.
My home congregation has has responsibilities that have to be met whether I'm there or not.
Yeah.
The lights still have to be on, things still have to be paid whether I'm there or not. So, and people, they understand that exactly when it has to do with their own household. And, of course, the church is the household of God. Now, that we have responsibilities to the brotherhood at large, but our primary responsibility is to our home congregation. And that's one of the reasons why, and we don't even say that much about it either, is that each individual, the Bible knows nothing of individual members who have a membership at large. No. No, you can't have a membership at large. You can't have, well, I'm not a member here, I'm not a member there. I'm a member everywhere, wherever I happen to be. And of course, I've known people that practiced that, and so they were always treated as visitors whenever they showed up to congregation because they had no home congregation. They were always on the road visiting somewhere, and it was by choice.
Yeah.
And they was driving by congregations, and maybe they didn't want to be tied to one particular congregation because that would be monotonous or something, so they're always visiting. And of course, as is the case always, when a visitor comes in, you see them maybe once or twice a year, then you treat them all wonderfully great and everything because they're visiting. Well, they're doing that at 10 or 15 different congregations visiting, and they're being treated like that, and so it makes them feel good that they're being treated like that. But we don't have family units that work like that.
Yeah.
So, it just seems to me to be so obvious as to where our priorities would lie with our own physical family, well, certainly then our own spiritual family in one given locale.
Yeah, and we mention sometimes the fact that this place is not holy. The front pew here is not holy. This is not the only place that you can repent of sin, and you have to come forward to the front row and make contact with it. And in the same way, as we've touched on, and Kyle has tried to make the point, there's nothing holy about these plates that we pass around. So, in the same way that you're not going to get to heaven because you think you've checked your box because you've shown up on a Sunday morning, you're not going to check your box because you drop $1 or even 10 or 20 or $100 in the plate, because as we've talked about our hearts and the purposing and thinking and those things, it's about trying to be a part of that, and that be our attitude in what we do. And so, the same thing is true when we think about these actions that we take. We want to equate them one for one. This is a check in my direction, and not in the negative, but in the positive, and that's it. But what an opportunity we have to feel connected, another way in which we can contribute to the things that are being done here. And it's a good question to just consider. And there are certainly ways to make arrangements and to do things now to be sure that you can still contribute to the work that's being done here when you're away. Even as Freddie mentioned, you would certainly do that to take care of your house while you're away. And so it's a challenging thought, and I do think there's many, many people who don't think about that, but we should. And I'll even mention this real quick. We're about out of time here. But Daniel Boyd said something back a few months ago, and I commented on him to him when he said it. But he was, as we say, presiding over the Lord's Supper. We were done the Lord's Supper, and we were to the offering part. And he made the comment right before he prayed, before he passed the trays, that if you're here and you're visiting, then do not feel obligated that you have to put something in the plate. And I told him I appreciated him saying that because, again, some people who are visiting can get the wrong idea that, once again, they've shown up today, they've dropped $5 in the plate, they've done their part, and they've checked the box. What he mentioned, and it's a good thing to think about this as well in a large sense, is this is our time, and it's Freddie's talking about, the family that meets here to make a collection. We often say, the elders have set aside this time. This is a convenient time. That's exactly what it is. So if you're not a part, then we're not expecting you to give. We're not reliant upon you to give to be a part of the work here. And so, he kind of made mention of that. And I thought it was a good thing sometimes to just bring up, because sometimes people are sitting there and I don't know, am I supposed to, they're fidgeting around. What am I supposed to do? Just, hey, let me clear your conscience. This is the family here giving. This is the time we do that. And if you're not a part of our family yet, or, not right now, then you don't have to think about it in that way. And of course, so it certainly opens the door for us to maybe do that that and talk to them more about that in the future. So there are some much worse questions in this section. So if you want to look ahead before next week, you can do that. And if you have any more, let me know, and we'll try to look at those. But there's at least 5 or so more, and we'll try to examine them as best we can next week in our last class on this material. Thank you for your attention tonight.